When Arthur was ruthlessly fired from his own company by his best friend and his ex-wife, they thought they had ruined him forever. They handed him a pathetic severance check and told the old man to walk away quietly. And he did, but they made one catastrophic mistake. They forgot that Arthur was the master architect who built their entire empire, and he knew exactly which hidden wire to pull to bring their whole world crashing down. Make sure to watch until the very end to witness exactly how his brilliant plan unfolds. Before we continue, please drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you are watching from right now. I absolutely love seeing where my viewers are located around the world. Now, let's get into the story. The mahogany table in the center of the boardroom was 30 feet long, an uninterrupted slab of ancient timber that Arthur Pendleton had chosen himself 3 decades ago. It had been the foundation of Thorne and Pendleton, the exact place where 2 ambitious young men had sketched their first skyline over cheap coffee. On this Thursday morning, however, the table felt less like a foundation and more like an executioner's block. Arthur sat perfectly still, listening to the sterile hum of the climate control above him. It was supposed to be a routine structural review for the Apex, their landmark billion-dollar waterfront development. Instead, he found himself entirely surrounded. Elias Thorne, his business partner and the man who had stood as best man at his wedding, sat at the head of the table. Elias wore a bespoke suit that cost more than their first office's annual rent, his face arranged in an expression of practiced corporate sympathy. To his right stood his son Julian, possessing the specific, dangerous arrogance of a young man handed an empire he did not build. And to Elias's left sat Eleanor. 10 years ago, she had been Arthur's wife. Now, she was the firm's chief legal counsel and Elias's partner in every sense of the word. Arthur had survived that initial crushing betrayal a decade ago by retreating into his work, pouring his entire soul into the mathematics of steel and concrete. He had chosen to maintain the firm because the architecture mattered more to him than his own bruised pride. Today, they were taking the architecture, too. Elias folded his hands, his voice smooth and heavily measured. He spoke of new directions, of aggressive timelines, and of necessity for visionary risk. He used words like streamlined operations, carefully avoiding the word severance. Julian was less subtle. He leaned against the panoramic glass window overlooking the harbor, sneering down at the man who had taught him how to read a blueprint. "Your methods are archaic, Arthur," Julian said, his tone dripping with careless cruelty. "The Apex is the most important project in this city's history, and your endless safety redundancies, your constant delays over microscopic bedrock anomalies, are hemorrhaging money. We need speed. You are terrified of the wind, and we cannot afford your fear anymore." Arthur did not raise his voice. He did not defend a lifetime of engineering expertise that had kept every single one of Elias's impossible glass dreams from collapsing into rubble. He simply looked at the 3 of them, recognizing with sudden, profound clarity that he was sitting in a room with strangers. The woman he had loved was staring at him with the cold, clinical efficiency of an assassin. Eleanor slid a thick, cream-colored dossier across the mahogany surface. The pages whispered against the wood. "It is a forced buyout," she said, her voice entirely devoid of the warmth it had once held. "The board has already voted. We are offering you a severance package that honors your past contributions, but effective immediately. Your shares are dissolved into the holding company. Sign it, Arthur. Take your retirement and walk away with dignity." Arthur looked down at the severance figure. It was an insult, a fraction of his true equity, calculated precisely to humiliate him on his way out the door. He felt a heavy, aching weight settle in his chest, the unique grief of realizing that loyalty is a currency that expires. But Arthur Pendleton was a man who understood the fundamental laws of stress and pressure. He knew that when a structure is fundamentally corrupt, you do not stand beneath it and try to hold it up. You step away, and you let gravity do its inevitable work. Without a single word of protest, without giving him the satisfaction of his anger or the comfort of his tears, Arthur reached into his jacket pocket. He withdrew his pen, signed his name on the final page, and stood up. He left the dossier on the table, turned his back on 30 years of his life, and walked out of the room. He did not slam the door. He closed it quietly behind him, leaving the architects of their own demise to their fragile victory. The cardboard box held exactly 30 years of a man's life, and Arthur Pendleton noted with a bitter irony how little it actually weighed. A framed photograph of a bridge he had designed in his 30s, a vintage brass compass his father had given him, and a meticulously kept reference notebook were all he deemed worth saving from the immaculate, glass-walled office that no longer belonged to him. The walk to the elevator felt infinitely long, the bustling floor of junior architects and draftsmen suddenly quiet as he passed, their eyes averted in the universal language of corporate discomfort. By the time Arthur stepped out of the gleaming skyscraper and into the unforgiving hum of the city, his phone had already begun to buzz with the specific, insidious speed of industry gossip. Elias had not wasted a single hour. Messages from confused colleagues and old contractors painted the narrative Elias was actively spinning in the boardrooms above. Arthur Pendleton, the once great engineer, had simply lost his nerve. He was a relic, terrified of modern ambition, gently put out to pasture before his paranoia could stall the mighty Apex project. Arthur ignored the buzzing and took the subway back to his aging townhouse, a narrow, dimly lit structure filled with the scent of old paper and quiet solitude. He sat in his worn leather armchair, the evening shadows stretching long across the floorboards, and placed a severance check on the empty desk in front of him. It was a pathetic, calculated sum, a numeric representation of his total irrelevance to the empire he had helped build. For hours, he simply sat in the darkening room, allowing the heavy, suffocating wave of isolation to wash over him. The world had categorized him as obsolete, a man whose time had passed, and the sheer injustice of it burned like a slow acid in his chest. But Arthur was not a man who allowed emotion to cloud his logic for long. He was a creature of structure, of mathematics and stress points, and his grief slowly began to harden into a cold, singular clarity. He reached for his laptop, his fingers moving with practiced precision, and bypassed the physical architectural blueprints he no longer had access to, pulling up the public financial filings for Thorne and Pendleton instead. He knew the Apex project intimately. He knew the exact tonnage of steel required, the precise depth of the harbor bedrock, and the astronomical cost of the subterranean foundation that Elias had been so desperate to bypass. As Arthur scrutinized the labyrinth of public ledgers, quarterly disclosures, and holding company structures, the numbers began to tell a story far more dangerous than any structural engineering flaw. Elias and Julian had funded the Apex not through traditional, secure financing, but through a terrifyingly fragile web of short-term, high-interest mezzanine debt held by a ruthless lending syndicate. They had massively over-leveraged the entire firm, borrowing against phantom equity based on the arrogant assumption of flawless, uninterrupted construction. But Arthur knew the harbor soil better than anyone alive. He knew there was a hidden geological snag beneath the site that would inevitably require weeks of expensive, grueling excavation, a catastrophic delay that Elias's fragile financial house of cards could not possibly survive. The realization blossomed in the quiet of the room, profound and absolute. Elias had not built an empire. He had built a towering monument on quicksand, financed by men who did not accept apologies for delayed payments. Arthur looked at the meager severance check again, no longer seeing an insult, but the absolute perfect mechanism for a counterweight. The grief was entirely gone, replaced by the terrifying, exquisite piece of man who suddenly understands exactly how to tear a building down without ever touching a single wrecking ball. The financial architecture Elias Thorne had constructed was a masterpiece of lethal hubris. Sitting in the glow of his laptop, Arthur traced the toxic veins of short-term mezzanine debt pumping to the firm's ledgers, realizing exactly how little Elias understood about the ground beneath his own feet. To save capital and accelerate the Apex project, Elias had circumvented the deep core surveying Arthur had mandated, relying instead on superficial geological scans. But Arthur possessed a profound, intimate knowledge of the harbor's subterranean landscape, and he knew a massive, dormant ridge of granite lay precisely where Julian planned to sink the primary load-bearing caissons. When the drilling teams hit that bedrock, the timeline would shatter, construction would freeze for months of excruciating excavation, the daily burn rate would multiply exponentially, and the 60-day grace period on the syndicate's merciless shadow loans would expire. Elias was steering a billion-dollar glass ship directly into a hidden reef, financed by ruthless men who demanded total liquidation upon default. The absolute certainty of this impending catastrophe awoke something dormant within Arthur, a terrifying, icy thrill that completely eclipsed his grief. He was no longer the discarded partner mourning a stolen legacy. He was a ghost walking unseen to the walls of their impending ruin. 2 days later, Arthur sat in the sterile, windowless office of Marcus Vance, a notoriously secluded distressed asset broker whose clientele dealt in the brutal acquisition of volatile corporate paper. Vance, a man with calculating eyes and a voice like dry gravel, listened in absolute silence as Arthur proposed an act of staggering financial suicide. Arthur instructed Vance to orchestrate the quiet, aggressive buyout of the syndicate's primary debt position on Thorne and Pendleton. Vance warned him that absorbing such highly leveraged, toxic paper required immense liquid capital and carried an apocalyptic level of personal risk, pointing out that if Elias somehow finished the apex on time, the debt would simply be repaid, and the buyer would gain nothing but standard interest. But Arthur knew Elias would fail. To fund the acquisition, Arthur placed his entire existence on the table. He liquidated his pension, emptied every retirement account he had built over 40 years of unrelenting labor, and signed away the deed to his townhouse, trading the sanctuary of his home for raw, weaponized capital. Through a labyrinth of newly incorporated blind trusts and shell companies meticulously designed to obscure his identity, Arthur transferred every cent he possessed to Vance. The transaction took days of tense, invisible warfare across digital ledgers, but when the dust finally settled, the syndicate had gladly sold their risk at a premium. Arthur moved his few remaining possessions into a sparse, rented apartment containing only a bed, a chair, and a single lamp, stripped of every material comfort he had ever earned. Yet, as he sat in the dim, unfamiliar room, he felt profound and absolute power humming in his veins. He had transformed his lifetime of savings into a loaded gun pointed directly at Elias's chest, held by a hand Elias believed was already broken. The beauty of the strategy lay entirely in its silence. Elias and Julian had written him off as an archaic coward, an obsolete casualty of progress, and their supreme arrogance guaranteed they would never look for him in the shadows of their own ledgers. Arthur had weaponized their utter dismissal of him, abandoning the role of the victim to become the unseen predator, waiting patiently in the dark for the bedrock to strike the drill. The transition from a life of accumulated comforts to an existence of calculated emptiness was an act of profound purification. Arthur Pendleton's new apartment on the gritty periphery of the industrial district offered nothing but 4 pale walls, a bare mattress, and a single folding chair facing a streaked window that looked out over the distant, glittering harbor where the apex was supposed to rise. To the casual observer, this barren room was the tragic terminus of a defeated man who had lost everything to his own obsolescence, a cautionary tale of what happens when caution paralyzes ambition. But Arthur had never felt more dangerously alive. The execution of his strategy required 3 agonizing weeks of legal obfuscation, a grueling descent into the subterranean mechanics of corporate finance, where identities were erased, fragmented, and reassembled. Through the relentless clinical expertise of Marcus Vance, Arthur's liquidated existence, his pension, his home, the financial blood of 40 years of labor, was channeled into a labyrinth of holding companies, offshore entities, and ironclad blind trusts. They engineered a financial fortress so heavily encrypted that even a rigorous forensic audit would only lead to a phantom syndicate, an aggressive investment vehicle entirely devoid of a human face. When the final digitized signature was verified and the ink dried on the irrevocable transfer documents, the metamorphosis was absolute. Arthur was no longer the expelled partner. He was the primary creditor of Thorne and Pendleton, possessing the unilateral authority to demand immediate, total repayment the very second a debt covenant was breached. He held the invisible leash to Elias's towering, arrogant empire, yet the physical manifestation of supremacy amounted to a worn copper kettle and a stack of engineering manuals resting on a cold radiator. In this stark, uncompromising environment, Arthur confronted and mastered the final, most dangerous variable of any long-term strategy: his own ego. A lesser man would have craved the immediate, intoxicating satisfaction of vengeance, desperately needing a loud, theatrical confrontation to prove his worth. But Arthur understood that true power is fundamentally silent. It does not demand an audience, nor does it require the validation of its enemies to exist. He found a deep, sustaining comfort in the suffocating quiet of his rented room, sitting in the solitary folding chair and watching the distant, sweeping arcs of the construction cranes over the water, because he alone comprehended the true architecture of the situation. He knew that while Elias slept in penthouses and gave interviews about his visionary genius, Elias was actually a trespasser occupying a fragile house that Arthur secretly owned. The industry rumor mill continued its relentless churn, occasionally spitting out a patronizing anecdote about poor old Arthur, fading into a depressed, isolated retirement, broken by the march of progress. Arthur welcomed the narrative. He took slow walks through the neighborhood, wore his oldest, fraying coats, and bought his daily groceries with exact, deliberate change, flawlessly executing the role of the defeated retiree. He embraced his total invisibility as a tactical cloak, knowing that the most lethal strike always comes from the angle the opponent has completely stopped watching. He was no longer constructing monuments of steel and glass. He was building with the invisible elements of time, patience, and inevitable gravity of consequence. The financial trap was perfectly set. The structural integrity of his retribution was entirely flawless, and all that remained for the architect was a quiet, exquisite luxury of waiting for the earth to break his enemies. 6 months dissolved into the bitter chill of early winter, and just as the frost hardened the earth, the inevitable reality of the harbor geology finally asserted its dominance over Elias Thorne's ambition. From a solitary vantage point, Arthur watched the rhythmic, ceaseless ballet of the construction cranes slowly grind to a hesitant, agonizing halt. The deep core drills had struck the massive subterranean ridge of granite, exactly where Arthur had calculated they would, shattering bits and halting the foundation work indefinitely. The financial bleed had begun, a catastrophic daily hemorrhage of capital that Elias was desperately trying to conceal behind a facade of aggressive public relations and hollow press releases boasting of minor design iterations. It was against this backdrop of invisible desperation that Arthur encountered them in a quiet, unassuming diner a few blocks in the financial district, a place of worn vinyl booths and bitter coffee, where Arthur often sat to read. The chime above the door signaled their arrival before Arthur even looked up from his paperback. Elias, Julian, and Eleanor entered, seeking refuge from the biting wind, their tailored cashmere coats fiercely out of place in the modest establishment. They carried the tense, brittle energy of people fighting a war they refused to acknowledge. Julian spotted him first. The young man's face lit up with the predatory delight of a bully discovering a wounded animal, and he swaggered over to Arthur's booth, leaving his father and Eleanor hovering awkwardly in the aisle. Julian tossed a crisp $20 bill onto the Formica table, the gesture dripping with theatrical condescension. "Let me get that for you, Arthur," Julian announced, his voice deliberately loud enough to ensure the surrounding patrons heard the charity. "It is the least we can do for a man enjoying such a quiet, early retirement. You must be missing the thrill of the build, though I suppose this pace suits a man of your cautious temperament much better." Arthur did not look at the money. He calmly placed a bookmark in his novel, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to become heavy. He looked at Elias, whose jaw was clenched in a tight, defensive line, desperately projecting the aura of a master builder who was entirely in control. He looked at Eleanor, finding no lingering malice in her eyes, only the deep, suffocating pity reserved for those deemed utterly irrelevant. She pulled her coat tighter, unable to maintain eye contact with a man she believed had surrendered to his own obsolescence. The profound contrast between their loud, desperate arrogance and his absolute, silent dominance settled over Arthur like a warm cloak. He felt absolutely no urge to defend his legacy, no defensive spike of ego demanding he prove his worth, because he was no longer an employee seeking validation. He was the executioner waiting for the clock to strike. He possessed the exquisite, terrifying patience of man holding the key to a cage they did not yet realize they were locked inside. Arthur picked up a ceramic mug, took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark coffee, and let a genuine, deeply unsettling smile touch the corners of his mouth. It was a smile of complete peace, devoid of any bitterness, which only seemed to unnerve Elias further. "I appreciate the coffee, Julian," Arthur said, his voice smooth and remarkably gentle, carrying the effortless weight of undeniable truth. "Retirement has indeed provided a certain clarity. You all look a bit tired, though. The wind off the water can be punishing this time of year. I do wish you the absolute best of luck with the bedrock excavation. I hear granite can be remarkably stubborn when you are in a hurry." Arthur picked up his book, returning his attention to the pages without waiting for a response, leaving the three of them standing awkwardly in the aisle. He did not watch them walk away, but he heard the distinct, sharp silence that followed his words, knowing he had just planted a seed of cold, paralyzing terror in the fertile soil of their arrogance. The disaster arrived not with dramatic explosion, but with the agonizing metallic shriek of industrial drill bits shattering against immovable granite. Deep beneath the freezing harbor waters, the foundations of the apex had finally struck the geological reality Arthur had predicted, and the ensuing paralysis was absolute. Every single hour delay bled millions of dollars from Thorne and Pendleton's fragile cash reserves, a catastrophic financial hemorrhage that could not be staunched. The massive construction crane stood frozen against the bleak winter sky, like the skeletal remains of a dead beast, while armies of idle contractors demanded their daily wages for standing on frozen dirt. Inside the gleaming, glass-walled boardroom where they had once exiled their co-founder, a suffocating atmosphere of pure panic had taken permanent residence. The 60-day grace period on their highly leveraged mezzanine debt had officially evaporated at midnight. Elias Thorne, however, still clung desperately to the delusion of his own invincibility. Sitting at the head of the great mahogany table, flanked by an uncharacteristically silent Julian and an ashen-faced Eleanor, Elias smoothed his silk tie and initiated a secure conference call with the lending syndicate. He was prepared to deploy his usual cocktail of aggressive charm and empty promises, fully expecting to negotiate a standard extension. He assumed he was dealing with the same ruthless but ultimately greedy Wall Street brokers he had manipulated for decades. Instead, the call connected not to a boardroom of eager negotiators, but to a single cold-voiced legal representative who possessed no interest whatsoever in Elias's charisma. The representative informed Elias, with a clinical detachment that chilled the room to absolute zero, that all lines of credit were permanently frozen. There would be no restructuring, no extensions, and absolutely no mercy. The primary creditor, an anonymous corporate holding entity that had recently acquired their debt in its entirety, had formally rejected every proposal. A digital notice of immediate, catastrophic default arrived in Eleanor's inbox before Elias could even formulate a coherent threat. The sudden, crushing weight of total financial ruin descended upon the empire like a physical blow. Julian paced the floor like a trapped animal, his previous arrogance entirely vaporized, shouting hollow, impotent obscenities at the silent speakerphone. Eleanor stared blankly at the digital foreclosure documents, her formidable legal expertise utterly useless against the ironclad covenants she herself had signed in her blind desperation for funding. Elias sat completely paralyzed, the blood draining from his face as he stared out at the panoramic harbor view, watching his legacy dissolve into a lethal mountain of inescapable debt. He pounded his fist against the ancient wood, demanding to know the name of the entity destroying him, screaming into the dead phone that he needed to speak to the man in charge, completely unaware that the faceless executioner, ignoring his desperate pleas, was the very man he had thrown away like garbage. Miles away, far removed from the screaming and the shattering of false empires, the air inside Arthur Pendleton's sparse apartment was perfectly, beautifully still. The small radiator hissed a quiet, steady rhythm against the biting winter chill. Arthur sat in his solitary folding chair, the warm glow of a single lamp illuminating the worn pages of his paperback. He did not need to check his phone or look at a financial ticker to know exactly what was happening across the city. He could feel it in the deep, structural shift of the universe, the precise, mathematical moment when a compromised foundation finally gives way to gravity. He turned a page, his breathing slow and even, experiencing the profound, exquisite tranquility of an architect who had just watched his masterpiece perform exactly as designed. The desperate illusion of survival is often the most expensive performance a dying empire will ever stage. In a frantic last-ditch maneuver project an aura of total financial invulnerability and ensnare new investors to cover the suffocating default, Elias Thorne transformed the unfinished cavern of the Apex's primary atrium into a theater of glittering deception. Massive silk draperies were hung to conceal the exposed steel girders, and crystal chandeliers were suspended from unfinished concrete ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow over the raw, unyielding bones of the stalled project. A string quartet played flawlessly in the corner, their elegant notes attempting to drown out the deafening silence of the halted construction site outside. Arthur Pendleton arrived at the Black Tie Gala not as an invader, but as an invisible observer, wearing a classic, impeccably tailored tuxedo that had survived from his former life. He slipped through the heavy brass doors and immediately retreated to the deep shadows near a load-bearing pillar he had personally calculated 3 years ago. Holding a glass of sparkling water he did not intend to drink. From this quiet vantage point, the hollow absurdity of high society was magnified to a tragic scale. He watched the city's wealthiest elite mingle and laugh, completely oblivious of the fact that they were drinking champagne on the deck of a vessel that was already resting permanently at the bottom of the ocean. The focal point of the tragedy was Elias himself, standing on a raised platform beneath a spotlight that seemed to illuminate nothing but his sheer terror. Elias was delivering a masterful, booming speech about overcoming minor geological challenges and the imminent triumph of visionary engineering. But from across the room, Arthur could see the visible sheen of cold sweat soaking to the collar of his former partner's bespoke shirt. Elias was vibrating with a frantic, animalistic panic, selling a future that Arthur had already legally erased. It was a poignant, exquisite irony, watching a man attempt to sell the lifeboats after the ship had vanished. The quiet contemplation was interrupted by the faint scent of expensive perfume. Eleanor materialized from the glittering crowd, her evening gown sweeping across the polished temporary flooring. She looked exhausted, the sharp lines of her face tightened by the strain of the firm's impending doom. She stopped a few feet from Arthur, her expression a complex mixture of lingering superiority and irritated pity. "Arthur," she hissed, her voice kept low to avoid drawing the gaze of potential investors. "What are you doing here? This is an exclusive investor event. If you came to beg for a residual buyout, you have chosen the worst possible night. Please, just leave quietly before you embarrass yourself further." Arthur did not flinch, nor did he offer the defensive anger she so clearly expected. He merely took a slow, measured breath, turning his gaze away from her strained face to look up at the towering, unfinished ceiling above them. "The acoustics in this space are exactly as I intended," he said, his voice carrying the calm, deep resonance of a man completely at peace with his surroundings. "I have no interest in your money, Eleanor. I am simply here to admire the architecture." He looked back at her then, his eyes perfectly steady, offering a gentle, devastating smile that provided no comfort whatsoever. "Enjoy the music," he added, before turning his attention back to Elias. Leaving Eleanor standing in the shadows, entirely unsettled by the terrifying tranquility of a man she thought they had broken. The illusion shattered completely at dawn. By the time the sun crept over the freezing harbor, the catastrophic default had triggered an avalanche of legal automatons, officially plunging Thorne and Pendleton into receivership. The empire was dead, its corpse awaiting collection. Elias, Julian, and Eleanor were summoned to their own boardroom at 9 o'clock sharp to formally surrender the company's remaining assets to the representative of the anonymous holding entity that had systematically dismantled them. They arrived in silence, the residual exhaustion of the previous night's desperate gala clinging to them like wet ash. They took their seats at the great mahogany table, occupying the exact same chairs they had sat in 6 months prior when they had excised Arthur from their future. The room was heavy with the suffocating dread of impending execution. Elias stared blankly at the polished wood, his manicured hands trembling slightly as he braced himself for the arrival of a ruthless team of Wall Street liquidators, the kind of men in sharp suits who specialize in tearing the copper wiring out of dying dreams. Julian chewed his lip, staring at the floor, all traces of his former swagger entirely eradicated by the sheer magnitude of his failure. Eleanor sat rigidly, her legal documents arranged in a futile, defensive perimeter, waiting for the devastating blow. The heavy oak doors unlatched with sharp, echoing click. The three of them held their breath, expecting a phalanx of briefcases and cold corporate sneers. Instead, the doorway framed a single figure. Arthur Pendleton walked into the boardroom. He wore the same worn, unassumable coat he always wore against a winter chill, carrying nothing but a single, unadorned manila folder. The air in the room seemed to vanish instantly. Elias's eyes widened, a flicker of profound confusion breaking through his despair as he watched his former partner step onto the thick carpet. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to scold him for interrupting a confidential legal proceeding, but the words died in her throat as she registered the terrifying, absolute calmness radiating from him. Arthur did not acknowledge them. He did not offer a vindictive smile, nor did he break stride to gloat. He moved with the slow, inevitable gravity of a rising tide. He walked past Julian's trembling frame, past Eleanor's bewildered stare, and bypassed the side of the table entirely. He reached the absolute head of the mahogany slab, the seat of ultimate authority that Elias had claimed as his own. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, so profound it was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of Arthur placing the manila folder onto the polished wood. Then came the sound that would echo in their minds for the rest of their lives. It was a slow, quiet slide of the heavy leather chair being pulled back. Arthur sat down. He settled into the head of the table, folding his hands over the manila folder, and looked at the three of them with the serene, untouchable patience of a man who had finally finished his calculations. The paralyzing shock hit the antagonist not like a sudden explosion, but like the slow, crushing weight of a collapsing building. In that single, silent gesture, the entirety of their reality disintegrated. The anonymous creditor, the ruthless syndicate, the phantom executioner who had systematically destroyed their billion-dollar empire without ever raising his voice. It was all sitting quietly in front of them, wearing an old wool coat. The gravitational weight of his presence pinned them to their chairs, leaving them breathless and terrified in the suffocating shadow of the man they had thrown away. The silence in the boardroom stretched until it felt fragile enough to shatter. Arthur Pendleton opened the single manila folder with the slow, methodical precision of a surgeon preparing an incision. He did not raise his voice to demand their attention, nor did he offer the gloating smirk of a victor. He simply began to speak from memory, his tone as flat and undeniable as poured concrete. He detailed the exact geological coordinates of the submerged granite ridge beneath the harbor, the precise bedrock anomaly he had warned them about 6 months ago, the very warning they had dismissed as archaic paranoia. He explained how he had monitored their accelerated drilling schedule from his rented room, calculating the exact day their machines would strike immovable stone and paralyze the site. With clinical detachment, Arthur outlined how he had liquidated his entire existence, his pension, his townhouse, the severance they had used to insult him, to anonymously purchase their toxic mezzanine debt through a distressed asset broker. He had weaponized the very engineering blueprints they had so arrogantly ignored, converting their negligence into a perfectly timed financial guillotine. Julian was the first to break the suffocating paralysis. He slammed his palm against a mahogany table, his voice cracking as he threatened massive lawsuits, shouting frantic accusations of corporate sabotage and fraudulent acquisition. Arthur did not even blink, nor did he look at the young man. He merely slid a single notarized covenant across the polished wood, tapping the signature line where Julian and his father had blindly signed away their immediate default rights to any primary creditor, regardless of that creditor's identity. Julian stared at his own ink, the false bravado draining from his body as he collapsed back into his chair, utterly neutralized by the mathematics of the law. Elias, watching his son break, abandoned all remaining pretense of dignity. The great visionary leaned forward, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat, his voice reduced to a desperate, breathless plea. He begged Arthur to remember their 30-year history, pleading for a restructured partnership, frantically promising that together they could redesign the foundation, pacify the investors, and share the empire once again. Arthur looked at Elias, feeling a strange, profound emptiness where his grief and betrayal used to reside. There was no anger left to give, no burning desire for dramatic vengeance, only the chilling, absolute indifference of an engineer looking at a condemned structure. He denied Elias the comfort of a shared emotional history, offering no hatred for the man to push against, only a terrifying, hollow void. "I am not here to negotiate a partnership, Elias," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a quiet, devastating register. "I am here to foreclose." Arthur methodically slid 3 individual termination documents across the table. The first was for Julian, stripping him of his corporate title and barring him from the premises. The second was for Elias, formally foreclosing on his shares and terminating his position as CEO of the firm he had stolen. The third notice he handed directly to Eleanor. She looked at the paper, her formidable composure entirely shattering as she realized her lucrative legal contract was permanently nullified by the new ownership. "You are all officially dismissed," Arthur stated gently, closing the empty manila folder and resting his hands upon it. "You will leave your access cards on this table, and you will vacate my building within the hour." The surgical execution of justice was complete. Arthur had not raised his hand or his voice, yet he had effortlessly excised them from their own lives, taking absolutely everything they possessed and leaving them with nothing but the heavy, unshakable weight of his power. The cleansing of the empire was an act of quiet, deliberate restoration rather than loud vengeance. In the weeks that followed the Borden foreclosure, Arthur Pendleton methodically dismantled the toxic legacy of his predecessors. He officially renamed the firm Pendleton Associates, stripping away Elias's name with the same clinical efficiency he used to purge the holding company of its suffocating mezzanine debt. He halted the frantic, reckless push on the Apex project, choosing instead to absorb the immediate financial penalties in exchange for structural truth. He brought in a trusted syndicate of older, uncompromising geological engineers, men who respected the earth and understood the absolute necessity of patience. Together, they spent 3 painstaking months excavating the subterranean granite ridge that Elias had tried to ignore, pouring millions of dollars into a reinforced foundation that would safely anchor the billion-dollar glass tower for a century. The industry rumor mill, which had once dismissed Arthur as a broken relic, now whispered his name with profound, almost fearful reverence, recognizing the terrifying brilliance of the trap he had sprung. Arthur, however, found no joy in the whispers. He found his satisfaction entirely in the work. He returned to the drafting table, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of the architect's pencil in his hand, breathing life back into the compromised blueprints. It was late on a rain-slicked Tuesday evening, long after the junior draftsman had gone home, when Arthur encountered the final ghost of his past. He stepped into the dimly lit, marble-floored lobby of the Pendleton Associates building to find Eleanor waiting near the elevator banks. She was wearing a subdued trench coat, stripped of her usual formidable armor of expensive jewelry and corporate arrogance. She looked incredibly small, her posture carrying the heavy, unmistakable burden of a woman who had gambled her entire life on a facade and lost. As Arthur approached, she stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly as she offered a carefully rehearsed apology, speaking of regret, of being blinded by Elias's ambition, and delicately suggesting that perhaps they could find a way to navigate the future together, to rebuild what they had lost a decade ago. Arthur stopped and looked at her, his expression carrying no malice, only a deep, enduring exhaustion. He saw the desperate calculation in her eyes, the tragic realization that she was drawn not to him, but to the unshakable power he now held. He understood then, with absolute certainty, that true worth cannot be stolen, nor can it be manufactured by those who do not possess it. He did not offer her forgiveness, nor did he offer her cruelty. He simply stepped into the waiting elevator, pressed a button for the penthouse floor, and looked at her one last time. "I am already rebuilding, Eleanor," he said gently, his voice perfectly steady, "and I am building alone." He held her gaze as the heavy brass door slid silently shut, severing the final tie to a life he no longer needed. Months later, Arthur stood on the exposed concrete floor of the newly completed, highest level of the Apex. The winter chill had surrendered to a warm spring breeze that swept through the massive, open-air atrium. Below him, the vast, glittering expanse of the city skyline stretched out to the horizon, a sea of lights reflecting in the dark harbor waters. The building beneath his feet was whole, uncompromised, and perfectly secure, anchored deeply into the immovable rock. He stood in the quiet darkness, a solitary architect at the summit of his own design, experiencing a profound, absolute peace. He had lost his company, his wife, and his life savings, only to realize that the most impenetrable structures a man can build are the ones he constructs within his own soul. If you enjoyed this journey of quiet resilience and ultimate triumph, please consider taking a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories, and share this script with someone who appreciates the timeless value of substance over facade.